listener production.
Hey, Chris Spyrou with you. Happy Friday and welcome to The Briefing. You might have heard Anthony Albanese really pushing us to buy Australian-made goods over the past couple of weeks in response to Trump's tariffs. But what is it that makes a product Australian? And are you really supporting our economy by filling your trolleys with Tim Tams, Milo and Bundy? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Tara Cassidy. It's Friday, the 28th of March.
Good morning, Chris, and good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. We are nearly at the weekend. Now open up your calendar apps and strap yourselves in, Australia, because we are heading to the polls. Pop it in your diaries. May the 3rd, the Prime Minister's reportedly heading over to the Governor-General's this morning to request the date to be set, which will trigger a 5-week election campaign. And if yesterday's taught us anything, it's going to be a scrappy one, Chris.
Yeah, this morning we would have led with Peter Dutton's budget reply, but just an hour before he was going to get up in the House of Reps to deliver it last night, the ABC broke the news that Albo was calling the election today. On the back end of that quote-unquote accidental leak, scrappy is the right word, Tara, and you know what? I'm kind of here for it.
We live literally in the best country in the world, but only, and I stress this point, if we're governed well. When Australia is governed badly, dreams and ambitions become beyond reach. And that's what's happened during the last 3 years of the Albanese government.
That was the opposition leader Peter Dutton delivering his reply to Tuesday's budget there, giving us a very, very strong preview of what we can expect over the next 36 days. He also went on to reveal how he would slash our energy bills, migration and the public service.
Yeah, and a key promise from Dutton last night was the LNP's plan to immediately force gas companies to set aside up to 20% of their supply for domestic use if elected.
This is all about ensuring Australian gas is for Australians.
Hear, hear. He also formally committed to cutting the fuel excise, which we heard about yesterday, by 25 cents, repealing Labor's top-up tax cuts, defunding pro-environment legal groups and some renewable energy upgrades, deregistering the CFMEU, stopping the boats and deporting non-citizen criminals, slashing permanent migration by 25%, banning foreign investors and temporary residents from purchasing Aussie homes for 2 years, and stricter caps on foreign students to ease pressure in the housing and rental market. And as to what he would do with the public service, 41,000 public servants based in Canberra, hired under Labor, would be on the chopping block. He says it would not affect frontline service delivery roles or impact essential services like health, aged care or the NDIS.
Yeah, so for a party that's been criticised over the last few weeks for being very thin on policy, we had a lot coming out last night. It was good that we got a bit of a recap as to their policy positions on a lot of things. I think last night gave us a pretty clear picture of what we're in for if a Dutton coalition government is elected. So it was a bit of a mix of new and already announced policy coming through last night. He reiterated his party's support for nuclear energy, no surprises there, saying when compared to Labor's energy plans, it will save Australian taxpayers $236 billion. Now, he says that was independently costed. I'm certain that will be ripped to shreds over the coming days by Labor. He also pledged, and this is something that I actually really liked, he pledged $50 million to food charities like Food Bank and Oz Harvest over the next 4 years, and that would go towards feeding programs in schools, which I think, you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone going, that's a terrible idea. And he also committed to doubling subsidised mental health visits from 10 to 20 a year. Something he held really close to his chest was how much he'd increase defence spending by, saying it was, quote, significant, but he will not reveal it then and there. He would reveal it during the campaign. So giving us, I guess, a teaser. I don't know if anyone listening here really, is hooked on to that prospect, but, we'll wait and see. And, Tara, as much as it was thick on policy and positions and cuts and da-da-da-da-da, he also showed us something that we very rarely see from the opposition leader, and that was a little bit of personality when he was wrapping up his speech.
I want to give a shout out to Kiralee tonight, who's just had surgery on her wrist and is at home watching with Rebecca, Harry and Tom, unless maths clashes with this broadcast.
Yeah, that one winning the laughs of course, the coalition and some of the Labor Party members that were there too. And just if you're not across it, Kirilee's his wife and Rebecca, Harry and Tom are his kids.
Thousands of Nine newspaper subscribers have had their data exposed in a major cybersecurity breach. Subscribers to outlets like The Age, Sydney Morning Herald and the Australian Financial Review have been impacted. Information that's been affected includes names, addresses and emails, but not passwords or payment details, apparently.
Thank God.
A Nine spokesperson says they're currently reaching out to anyone whose details have been exposed. The company's saying it wasn't a hack on its own internal tech, rather a less secure third-party supplier, and the info has since been removed from online.
Oh, God, Tara, this is like news that I did not want to wake up to this morning.
We're both subscribers, so...
Yeah, I know, it's terrible. And look, it is the second major security breach in Australia in recent days. We reported yesterday that 9,000 court files, including AVOs and affidavits from the New South Wales Courts online registry, was also breached last week. Police say they still don't know who's behind the breach, which was only detected because of routine maintenance on the site, which is so spooky and freaky. But anyway, the state's Attorney General saying they didn't alert the public earlier as it would have compromised the investigation. As to what we know now, it'll take another week or so to figure out exactly what files have been accessed. Authorities urging anyone concerned they might be involved or that their safety is at risk, particularly domestic violence survivors, to reach out directly to their local police station.
And it just feels like almost every week or every second day at the moment we're hearing of some kind of cyber security breach online. Now, Chris, while we're talking about Nine and the courts, there's been a development in a separate Channel 9 and court-related saga. Ben Roberts-Smith has requested a retrial in his war crimes defamation case, claiming there's been a miscarriage of justice. He's lodged a bid with the full federal court, claiming his confidential and privileged legal strategy for the case was unlawfully obtained by Nine after recordings of one of the journalists that was involved in the case, Nick McKenzie, was aired, where he can be heard saying that he'd breached his ethics by obtaining part of Roberts-Smith's legal strategy, but saying that it would be helpful to Nine's case against him. So Ben Roberts-Smith's claiming that it gave Nine an unfair advantage in the defamation trial against him, which he went on to lose and then was branded a war criminal.
Search efforts are continuing this morning for a Queensland police officer who vanished while surfing near Byron Bay on Tuesday. Inspector Jay Nataro had been down in Byron for his birthday with a massive air, sea and land search started after he failed to turn up to work in Ipswich, west of Brisbane, earlier this week. His surfboard and leg rope have been found some 500 metres away from where his car was parked.
And News Corp's reported overnight that the officer's part of a close circle of surfing mates, which includes Hollywood star Chris Hemsworth and former pro surfer Luke Munro, who live in that area and who've both been part of those search efforts. Emergency crews from both New South Wales and Queensland are using sonar and drones, police divers, all of the efforts to try and find him as part of their ongoing search today.
A magazine at the centre of an encrypted app messaging saga in the US has now published further screenshots in what it's alleged are US military attack plans on Yemen after the Trump administration played down the contents of the messages that were leaked earlier this week. The Signal group chat between several US officials and the Defense Secretary outlined plans for US airstrikes in Yemen and the targeting of a particular militant, which the editor from The Atlantic magazine was accidentally added to. A national security advisor in the US has since taken responsibility for the mistake.
Now, Trump's administration has continuously insisted that no staff were put at risk by this leak and that no live intelligence was shared about the operation. But the magazine's now come out and published what it's saying are the messages which appear to show a timeline of the strikes, instructions on a drone attack, and details on when to attack this particular leader. And now after the new article was released, the White House secretaries doubled down on its stance and called the story a hoax written by a, quote, Trump hater and claiming that the exchanges were not war plans, again, in quotes.
Yeah, I mean, Tara, I've seen these screenshots. I've read this story. I can't see in what world that these are not war plans. There's even some, obviously the Democrats have come out to slam this, and this has been in the spotlight all week, but there have been some senior Republicans breaking rank this week to come out and say, we are astounded that US personnel was not harmed in this leak, because by simple virtue of adding an editor of a magazine to a group chat, it opens the door to questions of, well, who else could have been added and who else could get their hands on this information? So to their point, very, very lucky that this didn't end in tragedy. While we're talking about the US and Trump, I want to very briefly get everyone across what happened yesterday in Parliament. Anthony Albanese has returned the courtesy and invited the US President, Donald Trump, down under after being invited by Donald Trump to the US. That reciprocal invitation has been slammed by the leader of the Greens, Adam Bandt, and it actually gave us some very cheeky moments during question time yesterday from the Greens member for Brisbane, Stephen Bates.
Prime Minister, why would you invite Donald Trump to Australia when you've got a Timu Trump sitting right opposite you?
I will allow the member to rephrase that question.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister still. Given Trump's attacks on democracy and Western institutions and even threatening our allies and even the PBS, why would you invite him to Australia?
And of course, the Prime Minister came out to say that, look, we are allies. This is what you do. You return the invitation. And while we might disagree on politics, being a world leader means that, sometimes you agree to disagree and you have to put your position to other people, and you have to live in this world where you're not surrounded by like-minded individuals. So I know a little bit of fun coming out of Parliament yesterday.
Yeah, the sass of Timu Trump. And we should say Peter Dutton can be seen actually smiling to that. I think he's kind of just owning the term. It kind of fits the brief a little bit. So I don't think he's entirely insulted by that. But a little bit of fun anyway. We love to see a bit of spice happening in Parliament, don't we?
Yeah, and I mean, the way he wears it, kind of like a badge of honour, is to say that I'm not like Trump. If you're calling me a knockoff Trump, that means I'm nothing like him. So whatever, Peter Dutton. Anyway, let's get into my deep dive. Thank you, Tara. That is it for the headlines. And thank you, headline listeners, for another excellent week. Tara, well done on your first week on the briefing headlines.
Thank you.
We are stoked to have you here. Next up is my deep dive, looking into Albo's latest push, pushing us to buy Australian-made, what that means and whether it's any good for our economy. Before I get into my little spiel about why you should listen to this deep dive, let us first hear from our Prime Minister, the Honourable Anthony Albanese.
Tim Tams, Twisties, Shapes, Milo, Bundy. Aussie products are the best in the world. You know it. So next time you shop, think Australian made. Labor will always back Aussie companies and quality Aussie products because we support Aussie jobs.
Ah, how very patriotic. That was a video Albo posted to his Instagram and TikTok little over a week ago, and it's part of a wider campaign he and his party's launched to protect us against Donald Trump's tariffs. But here's an inconvenient truth. Tim Tams and Shapes, they're both made in Australia by Arnott, which is actually owned by an American private equity firm. Then we have Twisties, made by Smiths, which is a subsidiary of a US multinational. Milo? Well, you're going to have to listen to the chat to find that one out. But what about Albo's beloved Bundy? Well, Bundaberg Brewed Drinks is, in fact, drumroll please, Australian owned and operated. So the money theoretically stays here and doesn't go into feeding a massive foreign parent company, which, based on the ones that I've just read out, are mostly based in the US. Glad we sorted that out. But despite all the detail schmeetails, Albo is still pushing on with his Team Australia rhetoric, with $20 million carved out of the budget for initiatives driving consumers to buy domestically produced products. Given now what we know, is that actually going to benefit our local economies? And more broadly, can it really protect us from Trump's radical economic policy? Joining me now is the CEO of the Consumer Policy Research Centre, Erin Turner. Erin, welcome back to the briefing. I'm going shopping tomorrow. Should I follow my Prime Minister's lead and sub out my Oreos and sub in more Tim Tams?
It depends on what you care about. The answer is maybe. So you would have seen our Prime Minister is pushing us to buy Australian, response to a lot of the international tariffs and trade issues. But it's a really nuanced decision. You've got to think about if something is grown in Australia, made or manufactured in Australia, who owns it, because Tim Tams are no longer owned by an Australian company. And yes. So it's not as simple as just saying buy Australian. It's actually a really complex decision, and you might not have all the information you need to make the choice.
Yeah, well, something that the Prime Minister has been peddling is that green and gold kangaroo symbol, the Made in Australia symbol that we've all, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a single person in Australia who doesn't recognise that logo. You mentioned there that it's a little tricky to figure out what is Australian made. How do you figure out what is Australian made and owned?
So look, the little Australian logo, the green kangaroo, it'll be on most things you can buy in supermarkets, almost kind of packaged food. It won't be in restaurants or cafes though, so it's for most of your food, but not all of your food. And it's going to tell you a few different things. If it was grown in Australia or made with Australian ingredients, and I actually have an example here for you. I'm holding a Milo tin.
A Milo tin?
A Milo tin, one of the Prime Minister's favourites. Now, it's made in Australia. So that means that there's jobs in Australia, there's good local economic activity, but it's only made from at least 55% Australian ingredients. That's also on the tin, which is useful to know. But it essentially, just under half of the stuff in your Milo tin, it's made from ingredients from farms across the world. And you won't necessarily know where else. That 45%, it could be from a range of countries. It could be from one. That's the missing information in the country of origin labelling. If we think about those tests, is it grown, made, or owned in Australia? Milo meets about 1.5 of those tests. It's about half grown in Australia. It's made in Australia, so it ticks that box. But it's owned by a Swiss company, Nestle. So this is actually, if your values are, I'd like to buy Australian, this is halfway there at best. It's not a genuine small Australian business or even a large Australian fully owned, fully grown and made Australian business. And these are the kind of complex things that we have to think about when we're thinking, how do we support an Australian economy and Australian businesses?
I want to talk about this idea of boycotting an entire nation's products. Does that work? Has history ever taught us that that works?
There are definitely things that countries have done over, the long hundreds of years of trading histories that we've had. Quite often, governments can make that decision for us by using tariffs, which is what's happening in America. They jack up the prices and effectively it's much harder or it's less worthwhile to buy that country's product. Sometimes you can see short-term responses, either to products or things from a certain country, but it's usually really short-term. Some people might remember after one of the wars on terror that after the 2001 kind of France was less involved in a response, and America was really angry. And there was, people were pouring French wine down sinks. They renamed French fries freedom fries in America for a period. It was this really short burst of anger, but it fizzled out pretty quickly. The counter to that, though, is that when there's these positive calls to buy for certain areas, when we can draw the link to what we're positively trying to do, we're trying to support certain groups, you can see some really meaningful change.
I do want to talk about, obviously a lot of the examples we've been providing and we've been chatting about so far is relating to food and packaged food. It's one thing to boycott a brand of tomato sauce or cookies at the supermarket, but what about when it comes to higher value items like Tesla cars, for example? Does that have a bigger impact?
It can. And the thing to think about with a Tesla car is you're not just buying a car. And for most cars, you're not just buying a car. You're actually buying the software that it runs off for a long period of time. So Tesla has a lot of control over the service you receive for many years to come if you choose to buy that car. One of the concerns I have when we're thinking about supporting local economic activity is whether things can be easily repaired and maintained in Australia. If you're buying from a company where it's hard to get spare parts or, a tyrant-like figure could easily turn off or change the software really quickly in ways that would disadvantage you, theoretically.
Not naming names for legal purposes.
You're handing over that power to another individual or another company that may be harder to control if they're outside of Australia. So, if the Prime Minister wants to have a discussion around supporting Australians and growing that kind of economy with Australian dollars to Australian businesses, one of the greatest things we could do is talk about how do we repair and control more things in Australia, not just buy things.
Well, that's interesting. It's interesting. There are several layers to this, and there's nuance that, some mostly gets overlooked. I'm curious to know whether you think Albo's efforts, and even if we take it to your extremities of being able to repair these things domestically, do you think that packs a big enough punch to send a big old FU to Donald Trump in, foreign relations and diplomatic relations, or not really?
I think we have to think about what our goal here is. Is it sending an FU to another political leader? I don't know if that is ever a good idea, but that's not my area of expertise. But one of the things we can do is think about what the opportunities we have are. What we can do is support Australian businesses, create Australian jobs, support Australian farmers. And one of the most important things I think we can do is help all Australian households keep the products they already own, that they've paid for, keep them running for longer. That's the good kind of economic activity you want to be encouraging. One of these big conversations that's been going on in the consumer world that I spend a lot of time in is we've seen lots of companies put up barriers for you to control and repair the products you own. They might make it harder for you to get spare parts, or one laptop company actually took legal action against someone who put a repair manual online, trying to hold back information so people can't fix and keep the things that they own for longer. They want you to buy more. If we can think about how we can stop those barriers and help people repair and keep the things they own for longer, that's such a good economic impact for Australians. We've seen other countries take efforts to give people this information. There's a beautiful rating system in France that'll let you know how repairable and durable your laptop is. We think we need that in Australia. And we're missing that opportunity and that positive conversation in this discussion at the moment. It gets a little lost when we're talking about just buying Milo and Tim Tams.
Yeah. And look, if we take Anthony Albanese's word as gospel, he's been coming out to say that while he's incentivising Australians to buy Australian-made, it also serves a bigger purpose, and that's essentially to create local jobs and boost local industry. Do we know that to be true, that, buying Australian-made, and given the caveats that you've put around it, that it's not entirely Australian-made at all the time, does it boost jobs and help support industries locally?
Look, done well, choosing to buy Australian can really make a tangible economic impact. And the best example I can think of is Buy from the Bush. So this was an initiative, a big push on Instagram, initially in 2019, to encourage people to support small businesses based in rural areas that were really drought affected. People really responded to that. They understood the positive reasons why it was beneficial to buy from small businesses in the bush. And we saw a really tangible outcome. There was a 30% increase in rural postage because of all of the economic activity, just all the stuff being sent from the bush to people across Australia and internationally. So we can do really positive things when we make deliberate choices as consumers. But sometimes it's hard to know exactly kind of through the nuance what is a good choice. The labels like the Made in Australia label give you some guidance, but you don't always have the information you need.
I'm curious to get your read on this. Obviously, we know there's a shift in global politics at the moment where more people around the world are expecting politicians and world leaders to adopt a more national approach when it comes to their economy, essentially putting their country first. It's no different for Anthony Albanese. Do you think these latest pushes by Albo are him really tapping into that appetite?
Yes, to a degree. And I think we have to question whether that's a good thing. Whenever anyone tells you to buy something for a certain values-based reason, you've got to stop and think, does that line up with your values? Now, for me personally, I'm really aware that with tariffs, some Australian businesses are going to lose business. It's going to be harder for them to sell in the international market. And I want to support Australian farmers and Australian small businesses. I feel good about directing my money that way. But I also don't feel bad about directing my money to some countries. I don't feel bad about buying from New Zealand or, there's some premium countries outside of Australia. I really want their goods. We need to stop and think about where our dollars go and what good or harm it does.
Yeah. I do want to ask you, though, naturally the question kind of arises, if every single person in Australia right now were to start buying Australian-made and boycotting US products or products from elsewhere, could we survive?
Oh, that's such a good question, because it goes to like, what do we make in Australia and what don't we make in Australia? There's some things that you'd notice pretty quickly. Like there's going to be some barbecue sauce that I love on the supermarket shelves. I'd have to switch to another brand pretty quickly. There's certain fruits and vegetables that are harder to grow in Australia or can only be grown under really like controlled, expensive conditions. So some fruit and vegetables would cost more because we're not importing them. Where we'd really feel it is probably less in the supermarket and more in white goods, cars, the big stuff that we don't buy anymore. We don't make cars in Australia anymore, for example. We don't make a lot of appliances or a lot of technology. Being really conscious about the physical stuff we have and how we can keep it's great for Australia, it's great for the economy, it's great for small businesses. It helps you stop spending more money. I know I don't want to buy a fridge every 3 to 5 years. I'd like to keep it for 15. But these are big decisions to think about. It's more nuanced than a prime ministerial TikTok can imply.
Yeah, and speaking of that TikTok, obviously it is in response to the tariffs and Australia saying that we're not going to put retaliatory tariffs on the US. We have other things in our toolkit. Albo saying that this is one of those things in our toolkit. Do you think if an election wasn't looming and there wasn't more pressure on Albo to be tougher on Trump, that we would hear this messaging?
Oh, it's so interesting. Look, I think part of it is it's about the election, but part of it is that Australia imports a lot of stuff. If we put tariffs on goods, it can hurt people in Australia as much as it might hurt businesses from certain countries. We haven't had major tariffs in Australia since the Hawke and Keating era, pretty much since I've been alive. It's been a long time since we've lived in a world where tariffs were common. So if the US chooses to put tariffs on goods, what it really affects is an Australian business. Their products will cost more from our American consumers. So this is why Albo's connecting the dots saying buy Australian. What's likely to happen is that some Australian businesses are going to be hit. They might lose income, they might need to lay off workers. And if you buy Australian, that can start to rebalance the scales a little bit.
Erin Turner, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us again on The Briefing.
Thanks for having me.
That was CEO of the Consumer Policy Research Centre, Erin Turner, speaking with me there. That is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for listening. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share your thoughts on this episode. You can reach out to us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok, just search Listener Newsroom. And if you're listening to this on Spotify and you've made it all this way, why not drop a comment? We love to continue the conversation there. And don't forget, we'll be back with a brand new episode from 4 p.m. this afternoon with Tash Belling. I will see you with Tara Cassidy on Monday morning from 6 a.m. I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you then.
Listener.